In this video, we're going to dive into another unsolved case in Melbourne from 1984. It's another single mum, just like Nanette Ellis, and only a 5-minute drive from Nanette's house, and only 6 months after Nanette's murder. And although there are a couple of similarities between the two, these women were living completely different lifestyles. This one's the doozy, so don't go anywhere. Welcome to Crime Scene, and no, even though we're talking about a different case, the first one that I've actually discussed that wasn't Nanette's case, we haven't moved on and we haven't forgotten about Nanette. There's still a lot to go through in that case, but I also wanted to talk to you about this one too. I haven't up until now because it does involve the murder of a child, and that does tend to make me a bit sooky. But it's important because it is a child for these videos. And I do understand where he was coming from because my last video definitely was a little bit rambling. I was trying to rush it and I was suffering from some major brain fog, which always seems to happen to me leading up to Christmas. But although I do really appreciate the advice, my answer is going to have to be no. I don't want these to be scripted. I want them to be a little bit more natural. So I will, though, try to not ramble so much. Oddly enough though, that last video was one of my highest watched, so that's a bit crazy. I don't know what's going on there. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm just going to give you a brief rundown of the Margaret and Seana Tapp case, and we'll look into it deeper in future videos, and hopefully anyone watching can give their 2 cents worth in the comments. So Margaret Tapp was a 35-year-old single mum with 2 kids, Justin, who was 14, and Seana, who was 9. She worked as a nurse at various hospitals, and she was also studying law. On Tuesday the 7th of August 1984, Margaret and Seana were murdered in their beds in their Ferntree Gully home. Luckily, Justin was not at home at the time, or maybe not luckily because he ended up having a really hard life, and he's also deceased now, but we'll get into that later. But Margaret was beaten and strangled with a rope. She had rope fibres on her neck, found on her neck. Seana was also strangled with rope, but this sick piece of shit also assaulted her in the worst way, and you know what I mean when I say in the worst way, prior to her death. Absolute animal. I mean, look at her. Look how little she was. I can't even tell you how much I'd like to be put in a room alone with this sick freak. But the next day, the little girl next door came over to walk to school with Seana, but she left alone when nobody answered the door. Then a guy who was dating Margaret's sister stopped by. I have no idea why, but he picked up the newspaper in the driveway, he knocked on the door, and when nobody answered the door, he left. At 6 p.m, Margaret's date for that night arrived. He'd come to pick her up to take her out to the opera. When nobody answered the door, he went around the back and he let himself in because he'd been there a few times before and he knew that the lock on the back door was faulty. Now, what happens next depends on what newspaper article you read, but apparently he went into Margaret's room and found her in bed with the covers pulled up so that he could only see her face from the mouth up. He thought she was sleeping, but realised that that was not the case when he pulled the doona down. One article says he then rang police, remembered Seana should have been there and went into her room and found her. Another article says he ran to the neighbours for help. Maybe it was a bit of both. I don't know if it makes any difference really. There was no mention of whether he looked for Justin or not, but they were both found in their own beds in their nightwear, so obviously they had gone down for the night before. Apparently a neighbour heard a muffled scream just after 11 p.m, and people also heard Seana's dog barking and howling around midnight, and they said that the dog was normally a quiet dog. There were no signs of forced entry, but with a broken lock on the back door and people knowing about it, that wouldn't mean much. There was also a pizza in the oven, which had been delivered. It was from a store that delivered. It wasn't like a microwave pizza or like a frozen pizza or anything like that. It had been delivered, but they don't know when. And there was a Dunlop Volley footprint on the floor, which has never been identified. And there was also a red ute that was seen parked up the street that night, and that's never been identified either. All the fingerprints in the house were found to belong to friends or relatives. There was no stranger prints at all. There was 2 types of hair on Seana's clothing and bedclothes. There was a long blonde hair and shorter grey ones that may have been tinted. There were semen stains on Seana's nightdress and shoe prints in Margaret's bedroom and the bathroom. The size of the shoe did not match anyone who should have been in the house. Now the suspects. Where the Nanette Ellis case had almost no suspects, this one had too many. Her date was ruled out, as was her ex-husband, who had a watertight alibi. And just a quick side note on that, I feel like police rule people out way too quickly. If I had $1 for every time I saw a crime show where a suspect had been alibied out by his wife, only for her to turn around years later and say she lied and it was in fact her husband all along, well, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you guys. No offense, but I'd be on a beach in the Bahamas rolling around in my piles of money. So to me, if you are a suspect, you will remain a suspect until the case is solved. The only way I will believe an alibi is if you were with me that night. That's the only way. If I see you with my very own eyes. But anyway, the date was ruled out. The ex was ruled out. Margaret was described by the newspaper as being, in quotation marks, liberated and highly social, which basically means she was dating everyone. She was dating people she worked with at the hospitals. Her friends said she had affairs with 4 or more doctors at the hospital where she worked, as well as a long-term relationship with a married doctor who was later killed in a car crash in 1983. There were other law students she was having relations with. There was a married man who studied with her at Monash, and he had slept with her on the Friday before she was murdered and had lunch with her on the day she died. There was a truck driving instructor who was giving Margaret free truck driving lessons. And let's face it, we all know what he was hoping for. I'm not sure if he got it or not. There was a Shell employee who had gone out with her and a 19-year-old man she had met at a disco in 1983. Can we just stop for a second and acknowledge how absolutely exhausting it must have been to be raising 2 kids, working as a nurse, going to law school, taking truck driving lessons, and having relationships with half the eastern suburbs? I can barely get out of bed in the mornings. I have to give her snaps for her boundless energy. There was also a family who lived in the same street as her in the 80s. She let one of the kids mow her lawn and clean her car, which worried other neighbours because they thought he behaved strangely. Apparently he had made sexually suggestive remarks to other women. That kid, his 3 brothers, and his stepfather were eliminated by forensic testing, apparently. The sister lived in a caravan beside the house with a boyfriend who was later jailed for rape. So that's interesting. Margaret's brother Lindsay was ruled out, but he thinks police should have tested a former workmate of his. That guy had delivered furniture to Margaret's house and apparently was a violent man with a record. Margaret's sister immediately mentioned a retired policeman the same day the bodies were found. Now, this policeman knew their father and had been bringing gifts to Margaret. Margaret was apparently annoyed by his attention, but she still visited his remote country property with Seana and Justin just a little while before she was killed. He had even spent the night at Margaret's house shortly before the murders. Margaret had told friends that he'd come on really strong and had tried to get her to sleep with him. Did I mention he knew her father? Gross. They found a whip and a length of rope in his car, but get this, he showed up shortly after the bodies were discovered and he let himself into the house to retrieve a book he had left there. I mean, what the, right? What the? And he refused to give his fingerprints, which I'm unsure as to why they didn't already have them considering he was a cop. He was cleared through DNA though, so let me just get to that because we mentioned that the kid and his brothers and his stepfather were cleared through DNA, and we also hear too that this cop was cleared through DNA, but let's get to that. In 2008, a guy named Russell Gesser was charged with the murders, but the charges were dropped after further tests revealed his DNA didn't actually match. Apparently, his DNA from a rape that he had committed was tested on the same day and in the same place as the DNA from Margaret's case, which led to his DNA being transferred to the Tapp DNA. So now the DNA is totally contaminated, so we don't really know if those who were cleared were really supposed to be cleared. So that leaves the cops in the mix. That leaves everyone in the mix, according to me. Anyone that was ruled out with DNA is back on the suspect list. Now, to wrap up this seemingly long list of maybe murderers, let's go back to that married doctor that Margaret was having a long-term relationship with, the one who died in a car crash the year before. The wife of this doctor had known about the affair and had had several arguments with Margaret about it. The wife said that Margaret had shown up at their house one night and begged the doctor to go and live with her. She said Margaret had thrown a rock through the window, then stripped naked before laying down on the front lawn. The doctor told his wife and daughter to hide in a bedroom while he calmed Margaret down and drove her home. The doctor was also paying for the house that Margaret was living in. He had bought it and allowed Margaret to live in it rent-free, as long as she was available for hookups whenever he wanted, I'm assuming. And according to reports, the wife knew about the house. The fighting continued after the doctor's death. The wife had found a sex tape starring her husband and Margaret. The doctor had hid the tape in his house and the wife found it after he died. She then confronted Margaret. She had a key to Margaret's house because her husband had one on his keyring. If that's all not bad enough, Margaret then sued the wife for the house she was living in. She claimed the doctor had left it to her in his will and that the wife had destroyed the will. The court actually gave her half the house and she bought the other half from the doctor's estate. Okay, so it certainly seems like the wife had plenty of motive, right? She was tolerating a lot from her husband and from Margaret, and I can't say what I would do if I were in the same situation, but I can say that the anger would be real. But we know that she didn't do it because she couldn't possibly have left semen behind, right? Even if she hired someone to do it, that someone would have had to be the type of person to attack a child. There are many people who can murder adults, fewer who could murder a child, and even fewer who could murder a child and do what they did to Seana. Well, I hope that's the case anyway. I really hope that's the case. But wait, there's more. The doctor's wife was very friendly with a pedo and was living with this piece of crap at the same time the Tapps were murdered. Piece of crap. $52,000 around the same time that Margaret and Seana were murdered. The pedo's ex-wife told police that the doctor's wife told her the money was a present. The police also found letters from relatives of the dead doctor who claimed that his wife had hated Margaret, or who can blame her for what she was doing, and was capable of killing her. So there's that. In 1999, a woman came forward and said that she thought a married man who was having an affair with Margaret might be the killer. He was later ruled out by DNA. So yeah, he's still in it. In 2018, Andrew Rule, you know, that crime journalist, he was on Sky News and he was talking about a man who thought his father might have killed them. This man had been convicted of interfering with a child, but there was thought to be many more than just the one that he was charged with. He said that the man was a professional man and that he must have known Margaret because he worked in several places where she worked. Well, that would have to be the hospitals, right? And if he's a professional man, we're probably talking about a doctor. He also said that Margaret knew other professionals in his profession and that she had had relationships with some of them. So let's face it, it's a doctor, right? That's what he's talking about. He's talking about a doctor. How disgusting to think that there has been a kitty-diddling doctor seeing patients for all these years. He may have even been your doctor. You might have taken your kids in to see him. What a messed up world we live in. But the Sun also said, this guy that was talking to Andrew Rule, he said that his father played tennis on Tuesday nights. Margaret and Seana were killed on a Tuesday night. And he wore size 11 Dunlop volleys to play tennis in. So what do you think? Married lover, cop, teenager next door, law student, doctor, scorned wife, truck driving instructor, or maybe even the guy who delivered the pizza that night, right? Or maybe none of them at all. Could have been a total random stranger that has not even come into the picture. Tell me what you think in the comments. I think this case was kind of forgotten about because, let's face it, it's full of really horrible people. You have Margaret, who was, and I'll be blunt here, a homewrecker, or, liberated and social, as the newspaper would have put it. She's not the most sympathetic of characters. If I knew her when she was alive, we would not have been friends. You have a bunch of cheating married men. You have a rapist who lives next door. You have a doctor's wife who hangs out with a pedo. A pedo, for God's sake. That's who your friend is, a pedo. Okay, blows my mind. I wouldn't want to be in the same room as any of these people. But we have to remember that a 9-year-old girl was brutalized and murdered and her family suffered terribly. I'm sure they were just collateral damage to these degenerates, but they're not to me. There's a rapist and a murderer of a little girl somewhere out there who has been allowed to continue with his life for almost 40 years. So come and help me get this maggot.